Good morning. I'm calling the August 14th, 2026 Public Health and Safety Committee meeting to order. Quick introductions. I'm Jean Borak, Chair. We have Councilmember Joseph Stratton and Vice Chair Cindy Rickards is absent today. And we have Mayor Dana Edwards, Chief John String, Manager Maggie Dobbs, and Assistant Manager Emily Pizzano. And we also have Sergeant Finaccio here today. So we'll start on the first item in the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes for June 12th, 2026.
I move to approve the minutes.
I will second. All in favor? Okay, minutes are approved 2-0. And then we'll move on to project and community updates. Do we have any updates on Montgomery Avenue corridor study?
Not at this time. I did reach out to Lower Merion to request an update. The last communication that we had with them was that the next public meeting to review additional findings and analysis would be sometime this fall, hopefully September. So I was informed that the engineering analysis has been completed, so we are still waiting, though, on final confirmation of a date when that public meeting will be held. But as soon as we have that information, we will be sharing it with the public so that they are aware and can put that on their calendars.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that? Okay, and any update on the active transportation plan on the Mainline Greenway?
No update on the Greenway. The active transportation plan has been finished and is published, so that has been available for, I believe, at least 2 months, 3 months now, maybe. So that is available on the website, and we do have a link to it from the borough's website.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next item on the agenda, which is we just have 2 discussion items. The first one is traffic calming request. Maggie, do you want to introduce this one?
Actually, I would like to kick it over to Chief String, if I may.
Okay, great.
So we had discussed previously the concern about Conway and Sabine and sightlines there because of the hill and some of the topography. It was a little bit beyond the scope of what internal staff felt comfortable because we had geometry there. So we engaged the traffic engineer to go out and take a look, and his report is attached. And to summarize, basically, due to the permanent retaining wall there on Conway, they are recommending, since that wall can't be moved or adjusted and we can't mitigate it in any way, installing a multi-way stop at the intersection there. They also looked at, because this is kind of a tag along, we got a concern after a minor crash up off of Berkeley for that intersection as well. And since it was pretty much co-located in the same area, we had the engineer take a look at that. And they're saying that it doesn't meet the requirements for multi-way stop and recommending daylighting or removing some of the parking there just to ensure that motor vehicles drivers have enough sightlines.
Okay. And there was also some discussion about turning that into a one-way.
They did recommend that, yes. I think we've talked about that a little bit internally. Jeff had mentioned some discussions in the past. I don't know, my opinion, it's 2 different issues at that point. Mm-hmm. The one-way would ease some of the congestion. Not that there's a lot of traffic, but it doesn't permit 2-way travel easily, so somebody's got to pull off. So we would be able to facilitate easier movement along the circle there, along the loop between those 2 roads. I think either way, no matter where those people are actually on the Sabine, we need to make sure that we take a look at the parking that's permitted now and see if we have to restrict some a little bit more to provide easier view.
Okay. Well, I think we should just kind of walk through maybe the 2 different intersections, or I guess there's 3.
Technically 3, yeah.
So we can look at so the Conway and Sabine Avenue. So Pannoni is recommending a multi-way stop sign there. And based on the report, I do agree with that sentiment. I want to hear what the committee thinks of that.
I agree also. I think it's a very difficult intersection, especially when there are cars parked along the hill. You really can't see. If you're on Conway going north, you can't see traffic coming down Sabine or east on Sabine until you're essentially in the intersection if you're in a car. So I think that makes sense. Just one clarification, an all-way stop sign on that intersection means a four-way stop sign? Is that what that means?
That is correct.
Okay. I agree that this is a wise choice for safety purposes.
Okay, so I think we do have agreement on that. It doesn't, it looks like in terms of traffic calming, that didn't seem to be an issue. Although, I mean, I guess the 85th percentile speed was 28 miles per hour, which I feel like it's still kind of high, but still under the threshold for meeting for traffic calming standards. Okay. So looking at, I guess my question is, if we install that multi-way stop sign, is the sightline issue no longer, does that completely resolve the sightline issue? And my assumption is yes.
Yes, because then, the anticipation is the driver is going to be stopping.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not looking to see a vehicle approaching from northbound, anticipating whether or not you have enough time to exit.
Okay. Okay. So, and then looking at Beechwood and Sabine.
I'm sorry, one additional thought there. If there's a stop sign, if and when there's a stop sign on the Sabine intersections of Conway, could it be possible, I forget what the distance from the corner would be for parked cars. Would that be evaluated? And, if there requires more distance from the corner, would that be taken care of, or is it already at the appropriate amount?
I'll have to go out and look and see. So in code it requires, without notification to a vehicle operator, they are still required to be 30 feet from traffic control areas.
Okay.
We take the extra step in some instances to paint that line and put a sign, things of that nature. So I can work with Jeff to see that maybe we can get a line painted, like one of those little angles or something like that, just to ensure that we're making it clear.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Joe, thanks again for putting that forward as a concern.
Very welcome.
And then Beechwood and Sabine. So that's currently stop control, and there's nothing on Sabine. So the recommendation there is for vegetation removal and for parking removal. Is that the recommendation?
That's what the engineer is saying, correct?
Okay. And I guess my only thought with that is I agree with that recommendation. Just I would be mindful of trying to minimize the parking removal to the extent necessary, where it still provides for safe and accessible sightline.
So that would be the one thing we might consider if we make it a one-way roadway.
Mm-hmm.
Realistically, we would be more concerned about one of the intersection sightlines. So instead of potentially reducing parking
Mm-hmm.
at both intersections, we could really focus on one intersection.
Okay. Is there currently parking just on one side of that street?
No, on both sides.
On both sides.
So, and then the north side is the concerning factor because both of those streets come into Sabine from the north. So the south side parking really isn't an issue.
Okay. So how much parking would actually have to be restricted to get the site distance without turning it into a one-way street?
So he didn't indicate we can basically said we would like their recommendation as what's
Yeah.
available. When we were out for, Conway, we looked and it sometimes is substantial. Like when we looked at Conway, if we were to restrict parking on Sabine to try to maybe mitigate the wall, which we weren't able to do either way, we were probably talking about 100 feet. So 30 feet's a general setback. So you were talking, nearly triple what is normally required. So we have to, now that was Sabine because it's a hill and everything else. Looking at Beechwood, I don't know if we can, maybe remove one parking spot
Mhm.
and see if that, supports a little bit.
I would want a little bit more information about the one-way conversion, as to what the impact of that would be, and I would be uncomfortable moving forward with that without outreach to the neighborhood first to see how they feel about that and if that's generally supported. Any other thoughts from the committee on that intersection
And this is Beechwood.
on Beechwood?
It will be, so there are two approaches of Sabine to Beechwood, one going toward Woodwood and one going toward Montgomery Avenue. Are both considered have safety issues?
From the resident that brought the concern, yes, they're saying that neither one is favorable.
Very good.
Looking at it now, if we're going to multi-way stop at Conway, I think that, with the potential making it one way, if we come around and bring people out on Beechwood, it's closer to the Conway intersection, so you're going to have people either or leaving from a stop or approaching a stop. So that would probably be, if we decide to do the one way, that would be my recommendation. I guess as far as the impact, I don't think we're looking at a volume issue just based on the nature of the road. What other, obviously, aside from engaging the residents, is there an impact that we want to engage the engineer on?
I guess I would like to better understand the recommendation for that. Is it access for emergency vehicles? Is it just circulation issues with like the larger truck?
Okay.
And would there be, I know it probably, because it's a limited road, it probably won't increase the speeds, but usually when you convert a two-way road into a one-way road, it does increase speeds, but I don't think that's a concern there. So I think just understanding that better.
If we were to move to a one-way.
Right. So,
And I just want to, in my experience near these intersections, I sense that improving sight distance may, and especially with the stop signs on Conway, that may be enough, that may solve the issues without the one way, but I agree with exploring
the
it.
cars are slowing down there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if there was just improved sight distance, that may address the issue, but more to explore. I agree.
Okay. And then,
We're going to pause for the interruption. We can definitely engage the engineer and see what he says,
Mhm.
but we also have the option of, before making that decision, if we include the sight lines at Beechwood, does that naturally turn that into almost a one-way roadway where the residents feel more comfortable, it's a little bit safer, and it's clear that just by habit, people are going to start going out Beechwood, so without effectively making it a one-way street, we can encourage traffic that way by making it safer.
right. Yeah, that's a good point. And then looking at Berkeley and Sabine, which is related, and the recommendation there is to remove parking there as well.
That was the only indication they were able to provide to afford, more sight distance.
Mm-hmm. And would that also change if we had converted that into a one-way? Would that not require parking restriction?
If we were to make the one-way and then you go in Berkeley and out Beechwood, then yes, it wouldn't be a sightline issue
Right.
because you wouldn't be coming out that way.
So converting it to a one-way would potentially reduce the parking removal.
Correct. Now, we couldn't increase parking because there's a hydrant there, so we wouldn't be able to really do anything. But looks like right now, if I had to guess, we probably have like a 30, 40-foot setback there going towards Wynwood. You know, we could look to increase that by another 20 feet, which would be approximately one more space.
And can you tell us a little bit more information about the crash?
Vehicle was actually from Berkeley, failed to yield to a vehicle that was established on Sabine and turning point.
So I would say if there's consensus on, it sounds like there's general consensus on the Benoni's recommendations for each of these. Any thoughts from you, Dana?
Not on this.
Okay. So I would say we should proceed with whatever administrative steps for an always stop sign at Conway and Sabine based on the engineer's analysis, and then for Beechwood and Sabine and Berkeley and Sabine, we should have Benoni and Public Works kind of review the intersections and see what the minimum parking restrictions might be to achieve the required site distance there, and including the exact locations where they would be removed. And then there's vegetation removal, just kind of identify exactly where we're going to cut that back.
I agree.
Okay. Is that enough direction from Betty, or do you need anything else?
No, I think that should be good. We'll work with Chief and Public Works and get the stop sign
Okay.
process started, and then we'll coordinate with our engineers and just continue to evaluate the parking restrictions, vegetation, and come back to committee with some more information detailing specifically what that might look like.
Okay, that's great.
One follow-up question. One of the residents on Conway who raised this issue asked if the stop signs move forward, do we know about when it would be implemented? It was a question that was asked. I didn't know the answer.
In the past, how long?
I mean,
It's
Public Works is quick after it gets codified, so
right.
whenever it gets codified, probably that week.
Okay.
Yeah, the actual installation is easy, but it's the administrative steps to get to that point.
And those are,
Chief, we'll need to look into that.
it doesn't require a borough council vote?
Yes.
Yeah,
There needs to be an ordinance.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
An ordinance.
yeah, it's,
So
We'll
something
look at
measured in
this-
weeks,
this months.
months. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so doing any sort of ordinance amendments, we can lump it in. We could theoretically lump it in with some of the other ordinance amendments that we have coming up. That's the most kind of cost and time efficient way to do it. But it's a minimum of 2 months for an ordinance amendment. Yeah.
That's the response I'm looking for.
Okay.
Thank you. Just wanted to provide an accurate timeline.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
again, kind of given where we are in the cycle of the meeting schedule, this would be introduced in September, and then adopted as early as October. So we would be looking at end of October at the earliest stop sign would be installed.
I'll let them know.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also, just by way of background, this ties in with what we're going to be talking about with the driveway intersection sightlines, which is the next item on the agenda. So Maggie, I'll let you introduce that.
Sure. Yeah, so this is, again, depending on how quickly we move through this could potentially actually tie in together as a single ordinance. If we do separate ordinances, it just costs us more money. So we had talked a couple of months ago as we were working through the vegetation removal program, was looking more into what our actual enforcement mechanisms were for vegetation at intersections. We did hear both from committee, council, and the public that the intersections are really the main kind of concern for folks from the traveling public perspective. We currently do not have any specific regulations that would enable enforcement at site triangles that would be defined and measured in an objective sense. So what we do have is in our current ordinance, which is what we've been using for enforcement, is that we have in our chapter 446 streets and sidewalks, which is the chapter that we've been using for the vegetation. So our vegetation encroachment into sidewalks and streets that we've been enforcing this summer, it's in the same location, which then does allow for us to identify any areas where there are obstructions within the portion of streets or sidewalks if such obstruction interferes in any way with the clear, uninterrupted, and unobstructed use of the public street or sidewalk. And then this goes on to say the clearance shall be 14 feet over streets and 8 feet over sidewalks. So we've been focusing on the enforcement for that 8-foot and the 14-foot clearance, but in a more broad sense for intersections, we do have this kind of more generalized language that says that we can enforce vegetation removal if it's determined that it obstructs uninterrupted use of public street or sidewalk. So in instances where we have vegetation at corner properties that would obstruct that visual sight distance, we can use this code to enforce that. This is in our regular ordinances. This is enforced by our code enforcement team. The other thing that we have is state law, so it's Title 76. This is enforceable only by the police department, not a code official. So the police would have to go out, inspect it, draft it, do the enforcement. So this all falls to them and doesn't involve code enforcement or admin. This does allow, again, same thing where it would be the duty of the owner to remove any tree or vegetation or any other similar obstruction if it's obstructing the view of a driver and identified as being a traffic hazard. So again, this is not based on any objective measurements. This is the officers going out responding either preemptively or to a complaint to say this vegetation does obstruct a driver's visibility and therefore they can cite this for enforcement. But again, that has to come from the police and that's not something that we can enforce from the admin. So then we would be putting our police force out there to do this sort of enforcement. From a practical standpoint, we feel that enforcement should come through our code enforcement and administrative side as opposed to our police side. Obviously, we have this though in our arsenal of tools if the need arises. So what we've discussed is that mirroring the efforts of many other municipalities that have clearly defined what's called site triangles, we could define what is a site triangle, how it's measured, what area it encompasses, and then limit the type of obstruction that could be permitted to remain within that area of that site triangle. So typically, most municipalities will limit things between maybe 18 inches, sometimes 24 inches. I've seen municipalities go up to 36 inches, and then typically 7 or 8 feet. So since our minimum clearance for sidewalks is 8 feet, I would suggest that we kind of use that as our standard. So you don't have to necessarily restrict everything on the ground, but just imagine if you're sitting on Obviously, there are cars that have higher clearances, but if you're sitting in a lower riding car, your minimum kind of visual is going to be anywhere from like 18 to 36 inches. And you want to be able to have that clearance sight in that window between, we'll say 2 feet and 8 feet. So if we say 24 inches, so between 2 feet and 8 feet, you want to have that clearance so that you can see oncoming vehicles, that you can see oncoming pedestrians who are in the sidewalk. So where we have instances where we have tall shrubs, fences, other things that obstruct that, you could have a pedestrian, say a jogger who's moving at a faster speed, might come out into the crosswalk and you don't see them because your angle is obstructed. We had Public Works, they have kind of a running list of intersections where they've identified as there being some concerns for obstructions. We did include that list here in the memo for you. This is not an all-inclusive list. These are just areas that have kind of been flagged by Public Works as falling within intersections that we would want to look at for obstructions. I gave a couple of, a little bit more information here about kind of how the site triangles are typically enforced within municipalities. There's a diagram here that would show you how it would be measured. So you would pick a distance, you would measure from the intersection, and then you would go out that distance along both of the cross streets and then connect the line to make a right triangle. And then anything that falls within that triangle would then be subject to whatever sort of limitations you would adopt in the ordinance. In terms of where this would actually go, this typically falls either under a zoning ordinance and it would be enforced through the enforcement mechanisms afforded under the zoning code, which is a civil procedure. That does actually require, if we were to file citations, it costs us more money to file citations under the civil procedure than if we file it under the non-traffic citation, which technically falls under the criminal procedure, which is how we do all of our other code enforcement anyway. And since we have this chapter 446 that we've already used to regulate encroachments within our streets and sidewalks, it makes more sense to actually keep it in there. So the recommendation is if we do draft any ordinance language, that we would draft it in chapter 446 and not draft it in zoning. I'm only bringing this up because if you do a comparison, other municipalities have these sorts of regulations within their zoning code specifically. We do reference site triangles twice in our zoning code, but we don't actually define a site triangle in our zoning code. So the zoning doesn't really have a lot of teeth to it. In the event that you have a zoning reference in zoning to something that isn't defined within zoning, we do have something in our subdivision land development ordinance. So that kind of is a proxy for how we would define site triangle. And then in the supporting document outside of the memo, we had our intern do a full sweep of other municipalities that have regulations and definitions for site triangles. So you have that full comparison there. I won't go through it. I know you've had a chance to review.
Would that need to be updated as well if we do update the vegetation encroachment section?
Most likely. So what we want to do is to ensure that any cross references to site triangles are consistent across our ordinances. So that would just be part of the ordinance amendment, is that we would just change the definition if needed in our subdivision land development ordinance. So right now we define site triangle in our SALDO as the site distance in an area formed by an imaginary diagonal line connecting 2 points located on intersecting streets, alleys, or driveways. But in terms of what those 2 points are defined as is not clearly defined. So it really depends on how much of an area you want to consider as part of this. The site triangle, so going back to the analysis that was done for Beechwood and Berkeley and Conway and Sabine, we were looking at that from an engineering perspective and looking at the geometry, as Chief was mentioning. So what site triangles don't do is take into consideration road profiles and geometry of the roads themselves. That gets into a higher level of roadway engineering that typically municipalities don't look into from a general encroachment perspective. So the standards for site triangles are typically tied to just the classification of the roadway and not specifically to roadway geometry. So for a municipality to do an engineering analysis of every single roadway and then come up with a site triangle for every single roadway it just becomes very cumbersome. So there's a more kind of across the board application. And typically, if you do have any variation in the size of your site triangles, it's based on your roadway classifications, which is tied to ADT, average daily traffic. So if you have a roadway that's classified higher, like Montgomery Avenue, than our local roadways, you would then have a larger site triangle for the higher classification roadways, which means that you have more vegetation pulled back from the corners so that you have a longer view in either direction to see oncoming traffic. Whereas you don't necessarily need that for lower volume roads because traffic is theoretically moving at a much slower miles per hour. You have fewer vehicles on the road, and therefore you don't need to have as large of a site triangle. So from a application perspective, what we would be looking at is doing a uniform application since we have local roads. We could, if you wanted to, create classifications. But the most simple, straightforward way of doing this is to define what your site triangle is. If you want it 75 feet or 50 feet or 35 feet for that distance, and we can do analysis to show you kind of what that looks like, how much area that actually takes up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful to see it mapped out and see where that lands in terms of how we're measuring that. And we could take maybe some example intersections where it's an issue and
Sure.
What that would look like.
Yeah.
I do have some concerns relating back to the conversation we had earlier about Conway and Sabine and that being a multi-way stop controlled intersection. It seems like the sight lines are the sight lines you would need at that intersection are less than you would need at an uncontrolled intersection. So I don't see that so much in any of these examples of different municipalities and how they do it, whether it's stop controlled or uncontrolled. So I'm curious as to whether the legislation can provide for that difference.
So in my experience, municipalities do not create separate classifications for site triangles if they're stop controlled or not. Site triangles are applied uniformly regardless of the traffic mechanism at that particular intersection. So they would not, I have not seen municipalities create or exempt intersections from the site triangle obstruction regulations if it's stop controlled versus not stop controlled. It's applied regardless of what might be there.
Yeah, I mean, so my thought is that basically I think I looked through all of the intersections that Public Works had provided, and looking at all of them, yes, I agree with every single one that they listed that there is a safety issue there. But then there are also other intersections where it might not meet a site distance triangle standard, but it doesn't actually affect the safety of that intersection. So I'm trying to figure out how to navigate that. And I think it does need to provide that flexibility so that it kind of takes into account the mature landscaping that's already in Narberth, and some of the properties do have retaining walls already. And I guess the other question is, are we really going to ask property owners to remove those walls if they do not meet the code?
I think we're balancing that and the risk of it could get hit on the bike. And how we balance it. So I don't have an answer for that, but it's a great question.
Yeah.
That deserves an answer. Yeah.
The other thought was in terms of trees, I do feel like it's very different than a hedge or a shrub. If it's just a tree, you can see beyond that, as long as it's limbed up and it's not, or the tree trunk is not so massive that it's blocking the sight line. So I guess my thought is basically that it needs to be context sensitive, whatever we put in, and I'm not sure. It does seem like some of the example municipal languages that you provided in the packet It does speak to that a little bit. So I guess it's a question of like how prescriptive are we going to be with the site triangle standards, and do we give, how much leeway do we give the code enforcement to kind of assess whether it's an actual traffic hazard? And I guess that's a question that we're going to have to work through, talk about.
Yeah, so that the language that you use there differentiates from it. So whether or not it creates a traffic hazard, the way that a lot of the site triangles work is that it's not necessarily incumbent on the municipality to demonstrate that it creates a traffic hazard, only that it obstructs the visual views within that. So the kind of understanding is that the site triangle is there because obstruction of the sight lines creates traffic safety issues.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the burden of proof for enforcement, it does not require that the municipality demonstrate that there is a traffic safety, i.e.
Mm-hmm.
there have been crashes or near misses or other reported documentation. So I just want to be clear that when we're talking about the site triangles, the burden of proof on the municipality from an enforcement perspective is just articulating that based on these objective measurements,
Mm-hmm.
that there is vegetation within that area that violates the clearance that's mandated within the restrictions. So by asking for proof that there is a traffic hazard or a traffic safety issue at play to then trigger enforcement would inherently require us to have the engineer evaluate each intersection, which gets much more costly from an enforcement perspective.
Which we don't want to do, I think.
Which I would not recommend we establish as a practice.
I guess my question is like, how much room is there for some technical judgment on the code enforcement officer's part to, when they look at that, or are they just going to just do it purely by measurement? That if it doesn't meet the standard, then it's a violation.
I mean, that's what code enforcement is does it meet standard or not? It's a pretty black and white thing. Obviously for things like historic retaining walls, decorative walls, mature trees with a larger diameter trunk,
Mm-hmm.
those are obstructions that would generally be, from an enforcement perspective, grandfathered in. You're not going to necessarily force people to take that out unless you do go through the engineering route and say that there is a clear traffic. Like if you have multiple crashes in that location and sightline distance is a major factor in those crashes, then that's a different mechanism of enforcement that we would want to take. From just kind of a routine enforcement, though, you're looking at this from a much more black and white perspective. And vegetation, if it's existing, if it's a tree that already exists, you just uplimit. The issue is going to be your shrubs, your evergreens, your arborvitae, and then your conifers. So obviously, cypress trees, pine trees, they have limbs that go all the way down to the bottom. You don't typically uplimb them. They could be very mature trees, so then you could be faced with an issue of do you remove the mature tree or not, because when it has the triangle shape all the way down to the bottom is where you need to trim it back the most, and that just looks kind of goofy. Then you make truculent trees. If you have a tree that you can uplimb, that you would normally uplimb, that makes for a much easier, and again, as long as you can kind of see through that trunk. And then if we make a determination that anything with a DBH of X number of inches or greater, perhaps, or, just anything that's already there, as long as you uplimit, it would be sufficient. And then this would just be restricting then from the point of adoption onwards, that you couldn't then plant anything new within that site triangle, so that we would not be in a situation 80 years from now where somebody plants a new tree where it's a skinny thing now and you can see around it now, but in 50 years, 80 years, that thing's going to be 36 inches and then you can't see around it anymore. So the restriction now would be the things that are already growing would have to be upland or removed. And then certain things could be grandfathered. And then it would restrict, though, installation of new vegetation moving forward. So we can't go back and fix what happened in the past. So we can only kind of correct for what we have now and then put the restrictions in place to ensure that traffic safety in the future.
In terms of,
Sure.
oh, go ahead.
You're following up on this.
In terms of grandfathering, are you just referring to walls and fences and the like, or does that also apply to landscape?
So again, it's really at the direction that we want to take it.
Mm-hmm.
So my recommendation would be anything that's a hardscape, that's like more of a permanent fixture. So stone walls, especially if they're like a historic stone wall, those would stay. Larger trees could stay because again, we're not in the habit of trying to take out mature shade trees.
Right.
However, fences, non-permanent structures, those can come out. Vegetation that obstructs, that can come out. And then really it's the enforcement is enforcement. So if it doesn't meet, then it would have to get cut down to below the 2 feet or limbed up above the 8 feet. And everything gets more or less cleared out.
It feels like enforcement should be black and white. And so any gray areas should be addressed in the ordinance itself to make sure they're not black and white.
Yeah, so you
Because
could,
I think it's unfair for an ordinance enforcer to have to make judgment calls. It should be black and white, and it's not us, council, and how we design the ordinance, I believe, to make sure that any gray areas are addressed in fairness to enforcement, I think.
I mean, I imagine there has to be some sort of balance in terms of not wanting to overcomplicate the legislation and kind of trying to think of every single scenario that you might encounter, different kinds of topography, different kinds of environment or roadway width and all of that. And it looks like most of the model ordinances that was provided in the packet, they're pretty straightforward and pretty just kind of standard.
they are. There's not a lot of nuance in site triangles. It is very straightforward. So to the point of adopting regulations for kind of what can remain and what can't remain. If you look at the examples, so Schwenksville and Hatfield, it looks like they have written provisions that would explicitly permit existing shade trees to remain provided branches within relevant height range are removed. And then grading, if it exceeds 6%, but if it's grading that's already existed as such, shall be regarded as compliant. So there are ways that we can draft things in to say, if it's here, it's allowed to remain. But as with any non-conforming use, so you can put it in, it can be pre-existing non-conforming, it doesn't have to come out, but if it ever gets removed, it cannot be rebuilt in the same location. So that's a standard non-conforming use regulation kind of approach.
I just want to share a point of confusion. With the vegetation ordinance, we had a really solid potential solution for this of a 4-foot height of vegetation in the right of way that we removed in April. And it was asked in April, do we have an enforcement mechanism for sight lines? And it was answered that we did. And I'm confused about about our process as a government leadership. Why did we choose to remove that when we could have left it in and had, much of this addressed? I'm confused by our thought process. Could we just put back in 4-foot height, within a site triangle in the right of way for shrubbery, or 3-foot height?
Can you clarify what the gap was in terms of, it seemed like there was some sort of gap in terms of what we could enforce.
Right, so the 4-foot, so as we've discussed, we do have an existing enforcement mechanism right now outside of the 4-foot, which is the which is that section that's existing, which just says that if we determine that an obstruction interferes with the use of the public street or sidewalk, then we can ask the property owner to remove it. So that's pre-existing. So that
I'm just going to interrupt, but the reason we're 25 minutes into a discussion right now is because that's a C plus, not an A plus, right? Or
right.
If it's great, why don't we just leave it and not have further discussion? I'm confused.
If you want to, that's fine.
I don't want to, but it's not a great enforcement mechanism.
Understood.
We have a really good one at a 4-foot height.
Well, again, so going back to, so the site triangle would restrict anything, we said 2 feet, right? So if we're saying 2 feet as our low, and then up to 8 feet. The 4 foot is kind of right in your sight distance. So having the 4 foot restriction. So what we discussed previously was that the 4 foot does not get you low enough to actually create the safety improvements and the visual improvements that you would be looking for at site triangles. The 4 foot also applied to anything within the right of way, not just at intersections, but anywhere within the right of way. So what that would mean is that anybody who has planted anything within the right of way, and depending on what the right of way is for that street, it goes into people's front yards. So if you have arborvitae, if you have larger shrubs or Rose of Sharon or whatever you have, you would have to chop it down to 4 feet. So it would create then a lot of non-conforming properties. And then the question that was raised at the time was, well, if that is the regulation, we're not enforcing it, what's the point of having it? And the discussion at the time was that we don't want to have people come in and chop down all of this vegetation to 4 feet, because if we're going to apply it uniformly, then we should apply it uniformly. There was a majority that decided that wasn't the purpose or intent. There was a good point raised, I believe, by Rick Traley's actually about, what the experience is as a pedestrian walking on the street and kind of having walls of vegetation, which is where having that 4 foot limitation could be beneficial. But overall, keeping it in was not being enforced. And it doesn't actually achieve the goals of obstructing vegetation within the right of way. So it wasn't actually achieving any goals. So by leaving it in, we weren't accomplishing what we wanted to see from a code enforcement and visual standpoint. So if it's not being used and it's not going to be effective if applied, then
I understand that.
and that's why we took it out. And that's why we said we're taking it out for that reason, so that when we get through the summer, we can tackle the site triangles, which is what we're doing.
And
Okay.
if I may, I think one other reason is that, let's say it was a tree in that intersection sightline, which is lived out and it's not actually causing any sightline issues. A 4 foot ordinance would basically require the property owner to remove the tree. Correct?
Right, because
Right.
it's any vegetation cannot be more than 4 feet. So all of the shade trees would be permitted to remain again, but that's where shade trees would be permitted, but you'd have to upland them, which you have to do anyway because they're next to the sidewalk. But the 4 foot wasn't being applied, and it wouldn't, even if it were applied, was not going to actually yield the results that we wanted to see. So it was not the tool that we wanted, so it was removed.
Okay, thank you.
Dana, you look like you have something to add. No.
I don't know that I can add it very constructively, so maybe not.
Okay. Do we want to talk about the size of the site triangle at all? Like what, I know in these other examples, there's different standards for different road classifications. So what are we talking about in Narberth based on our road classifications and our speeds?
Yeah, so if we take a look at other municipalities, local access streets is 75 feet. I did some just quick analysis and looking at what that encompasses. That's really large.
I feel like that's way overkill
for Narberth. It would really I think, be really shocking to people to see how much of their yards are encompassed within that. And I think it would result in a lot more vegetation than what we would necessarily recommend. So I can certainly do some measurements to show you what it actually looks like at different measurements. I don't know that we have the information at this point to be able to make a definitive response to that, and it might impact how you feel about moving forward with site triangles altogether, since I'm not.
Considering that all of Narborough streets are 25 miles per hour, and a lot of them are stop controlled, and a lot of them are narrow, I feel like we should do the minimum necessary, which is, I think it's 25 feet.
So I had mentioned 25 feet. I did look at the 25 feet. 25 feet barely gets you to the edge of the sidewalk, so it doesn't actually get into any of the yard areas where the vegetation actually exists. So really our minimum that we'd be looking at would be about 35 feet.
And this is measuring from which point?
So the center point of the intersection.
Okay.
So if you were good at it, so a three-way or four-way stop, it doesn't, or intersection, it doesn't matter. If you go from the center line of the or the midpoint of the intersection, you go 35 feet in one direction and then 35 feet in another direction, and then connect the 2 points. That's going to be your site triangle. So I did do some measurements. The 25 feet is too shallow and doesn't actually get to any vegetation. That really covers just the edge of the curve of the sidewalk. So if you want to get into some actual corners where vegetation would be, which is actually where your obstructions would lie, 35 feet is going to be the minimum. 50 feet is also pretty typical for local roadways. And in my experience, 50 feet has been kind of the common one. So what I can do is take the intersections that Public Works has identified, do 35 feet, do 50 feet, give you a little comparison in an aerial view so that you can see how much might be impacted.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to see where that would land.
Yeah.
At work, when we have really important issue that requires a lot of evaluation based on what other places have done and what works and what doesn't work, we'll form a study group that can do a lot of this work together. So it doesn't all fall on you, Maggie, and it doesn't have to, and it can kind of progress a little bit more quickly. Is that permitted, and is that something that could be helpful? Or otherwise, I feel like, Maggie, you've got to go do all this work and then present it to us in a month. And it just seems like it's such a disjointed conversation. I don't know. It feels like it's a lot of work for you, and many of us can probably help out with it. And is there an equivalent of a group who can get together and work on this together and then present it in a month, or how does that work?
I mean, I feel like, I do feel like we're kind of limited in terms of the meeting structure and the sunshine laws in terms of doing that, which is unfortunate. I do feel like we should be able to work on that.
Okay.
I mean, the point of the committees is that this is the small working group. But if you want to volunteer your time to assist in the evaluation, then yeah, we can certainly talk about that. And
that's great. Love to.
Yeah, and that'd be great. And we'd appreciate any input you want. So we can coordinate offline and work out something and share the workload to present in September. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Love to help. Thank you.
Thank you.
And in terms of the vertical visibility area, the recommendations to stay with 8 feet.
Yes, that is what we have in the code currently. We did also amend the code in April to reflect that because we had one other area of the code that said 9 feet was the minimum height clearance, and we agreed that 8 feet. So my recommendation for site triangles is that we look at anything within 24 inches to 2 feet to 8 feet is the clearance.
Okay. And then in terms of trees, does the committee generally agree that we should prefer maintaining the healthy trees that don't create any sightline issues?
Is it too early to agree to things when we haven't done a lot of research yet? Yeah, I agree with that, but.
Well, just to give some policy direction and legislation to incorporate that.
I think you need to make a decision on whether safety or aesthetics or whatever the other word, environment is more important. So like, I know one of these intersections very well, 'cause I live right down the street from it. I loved our Arbor V Day they have, but I was almost in a wreck yesterday and the day before.
Right.
They're not trees, but they're big enough to where they, they're kind of a tree at this
Right.
point. And I am conflicted on whether my personal safety or the beauty of the person's lot is more important. So I would want to like understand a little bit better, what are we talking? Is it one big oak tree on one of these 14, or is it lots of different things? Because I personally value people's safety over the environment
Yeah.
on this topic.
And I think there's agreement on the committee for that, that the main concern is for safety. But wanting to maintain vegetation as much as possible without affecting the field.
So what we can do is, since I have some offer of assistance, we go out and we take pictures, right? We put the camera at the height where you would be if you were sitting in a car, and we take pictures in each direction, and we get a sense, and we have the measurements so that we know what would actually be within the potential area of removal, if that would benefit that visual or not. So we take some pictures, we get a better sense, we see what's actually on the ground in those triangle areas. And that, I think, can better inform the discussion.
I love that. Yeah, I think if you're asking for community guidance, I don't have enough data information at this point to provide that guidance. If there's 6-inch trees all stacked together, or
Right.
one 40-foot diameter, 40-inch diameter tree, it's very different.
So basically, look at some example, see how it might apply. That'll give us a little bit more information to guide direction.
Yeah,
Okay.
quick question on, once we do that, there will eventually be a situation where we need to force the code. Wait, this is the one where it would be police, code enforcement, right?
No, we're looking at amending the ordinance to
It would be code.
incorporate the site triangle within our code, and so it would be code enforcement, not police.
Okay. So let's say we set these rules, we have these things, and then we go by and we say, all right, so-and-so notice a violation. What's the duration of time that they have to remediate that?
So that's the discretion of the code enforcement officer to provide that. Typically, so in my experience, I would give somebody 30 days for this.
30 days from notice of violation, or 30 days from like when they say they'll fix it?
So our approach is always not to go right to a notice of violation unless there's been multiple warnings ahead of time and this person is aware of the situation. If this is the first time that they're hearing from us that this regulation exists because it's new and that their property falls within it, then we send them a pre-notice of violation. So it's a notice of enforcement, giving them 30 days, and then we would follow up with a notice of violation. So we do try to provide a lot of leeway, guidance, education, and awareness before we actually threaten anybody with any sort of punitive action.
I would offer to council that you look at that and see if it's fair to. I'm not implying it's not. I'm saying I will look at it because I think when you have leeway and sort of best judgment, it gets into, well, Joe didn't have to cut his tree down, but I did. And Gene had 45 days and I had 10. I think people talk and then they come back around the house and then put some of us in a bad spot. So I would steer away from that and have a day 0, day 10, day 20, 30, 40, and then fines and we cut it down.
Oh, one thing that had come up with the vegetation maintenance program was that there's also a seasonal pruning window.
Understood.
That's ideal. So I do wonder if we can incorporate something like that or provide flexibility for something like that as well.
So I will say, if we're notifying folks about this, it's because there is a concern about visuals.
Right.
And to allow something to continue for, if we flagged this in April, but we're saying that
Right.
pruning shouldn't happen until February, then we're waiting 10 months
Right.
for something that we flagged as a hazard. That's not how government generally operates with enforcement. I was doing more research on the pruning window and was told that if you're going to be doing heavy pruning, structural pruning in the canopy, then yes, you do want to wait until the end of the winter. But uplimbing can be done at any point in time. If it's an established mature tree,
Right.
uplimbing the lower branches is not going to damage the tree, and we don't have to worry about the timeliness of that. That can be done at any point in time because you're not doing a structural reshaping of the tree. You're just uplimbing to make that clearance.
Right.
So we've evaluated, so some of the trees that we've evaluated as part of the summer's inspection program, given the substantive nature of the pruning, we have granted those folks an extension to do pruning later in the winter. But for those folks who are just uplimbing to, get the 8-foot clearance within the sidewalk, they have managed to accomplish that during the summer season with no detriment to the trees.
One more, actually, it's probably for you, Meg. When we think about the severity of the issue, do we think about which road it is?
Which, I'm sorry?
Do we think about the severity, when we think about the severity of the issue and any leeway we might give, do we think about busyness and activity on the road? For example, Shirley Circle where I live, there's 5 cars coming in and out, 1 every 5 hours.
Right.
As opposed to Montgomery where there's, 5 cars every 10 seconds flying by. But does that add into the rubric of
Leeway for,
when they have to actually take action on the tree limb or bush or whatever?
oh, no.
No.
I would say, because again, this is an internal policy that we establish with our code enforcement. So if we say we issue a pre-violation letter, we give them 30 days to come into compliance. And really that 30 days is for them to come and talk to us. So if they come in and say, hey, I got your notice, I'm talking to a contractor, they won't be able to come in for another 6 weeks. Then at that point, we've established communication and intent for compliance. So that's the working relationship that we maintain. But if we don't hear from them in 30 days, no action is taken within 30 days, then yes, we will file with a notice of violation. So we will escalate in order to ensure that compliance will happen. So as long as we've established communications, that goes a long way in the leeway that you're talking about. So the issue is that the escalated levels of enforcement is simply the way that we as a government can take to ensure that compliance will be met and that we have certain backstops and boundaries to say, like, we will work with you, but if you're just using this as a delay tactic to never do the work and the problem still persists, then we will kind of give you a hard deadline and move forward to the next step of enforcement. If it's something where it's an issue on Montgomery Avenue, say, and it's identified more as an enforcement concern, then maybe that just becomes part of the conversation in terms of how much kind of extensions we might grant a particular person. But typically we try to be consistent with it. And again, the goal is to always work with the property owner to find an amenable solution.
So you said a word I've heard for enforcement concern as opposed to what? Like, so it's more of an enforcement concern.
Meaning if it is more of a pressing issue. So if it's, this does get into,
I'm not trying to trap you. I've never heard that before. Okay.
maybe it's just a weird colloquialism that I have.
Okay.
That's not a defined term.
Not a defined term. Okay. Like, and that's like people in the code enforcement area are not sure that the person is actually going to do it.
Right. So if we haven't heard from the person, we have no assurances that they're moving forward with enforcement, then we will escalate because we don't have any method of communication because they have not responded. to the initial outreach where we've notified them that there is an enforcement matter before them.
Just curious, if a resident, sorry, one last motion here. If I go out and, like sidewalk on Haverford, there's a lot of spots where the grass is overgrown and it's gone from 4 feet to 3 feet or whatever. If I go out and cut it, is that against the law?
If it's not your property? If it is, are you asking if it is your property or not your?
On the sidewalk.
Right.
This is the edge of the sidewalk, the grass has come out, and I just go out and just cut that. Am
Right.
I allowed to do that?
Are you asking for your property?
Oops, on Haverford, I don't know on Haverford.
Oh, somebody else's property, yeah.
On somebody else's, I mean, it's a public right of way. I mean, sure, it's their maintenance responsibility. But
But I
if
could cut it.
I would recommend no, because it is definitely within the public right of way, it is open for general use, but I think that you're not an attorney, but I think that open for public use probably has a limited definition, and cutting something, I would not assume extend to that.
yeah, I would be wary of that only because it is the maintenance responsibility of the owner. So if we have other people coming in and doing the work, they might be, now if you talk to them and they say, I would love for you to do it, and you've established that with them, then
I mean,
go for
I
it.
think
But
as neighbors, you can ask, right, do you mind if I cut the vegetation? That would be fine.
yeah, but
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out the boundaries.
I typically don't do work on other people's properties unless you have their permission to do so, is the boundary.
Okay, so next steps are just, we want staff to kind of apply some proposed standards to some sample intersections and see what that would look like. And Joe, you can reach out directly to Maggie.
Yeah, and we have our intern for 3 more days next week, so this sounds like a great something to send her out next week and get some photos, and then we can coordinate on doing additional site visits and some kind of GIS analysis and taking a look at some aerials and coming up with some resources to help us with the discussion.
That's good.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so back to the agenda. We have committee reports next. We don't have a update from the EAC today. I did think somebody was coming from the police advisory committee. But I did receive the minutes from that meeting, so I can share that with the committee. We have the departmental reports. Fire company report is included in the packet. Police report.
No problem.
And no public comments. Take a motion to adjourn.
I so moved.
All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.